The following is a listener-supported ministry from the Grace Evangelical Society.
There's a great hymn, Jesus Paid It All, and then the phrase, all to him I owe. As free grace people, is this phrase in conflict with our belief about eternal salvation? Let's talk about that today here on Grace in Focus. Grace in Focus is a ministry of the Grace Evangelical Society. We office in North Texas, and we have a website, faithalone.org. There you can find out about our online seminary and our conference ministry, our national conference coming up later this year. Find out about it at faithalone.org. Now with today's question and answer discussion, here are Bob Wilkin and Mike Lii.
Hi, Bob. Recently, we did that video on Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the famous German theologian who was killed for being involved in an assassination plot against Adolf Hitler.
Yeah, you were going to call it martyred, but I don't know if you could quite call that martyred.
We actually got some YouTube comments also raising the same thing. They wouldn't call it being martyred, too, whether giving one's life up in trying to assassinate Hitler is worthy of being called a martyr.
Right. And by the way, that's on YouTube, and it's available, and a couple thousand people have seen it, haven't they?
Yeah, I think over 2,000. And that video was, I guess Dietrich Bonhoeffer was one of the early users of the term cheap grace. I looked into it, and I guess he had gotten it from a American politician preacher named Adam Clayton Powell. Yeah, and I guess he had used the term cheap grace, but I think kind of in reference to those within the church who are, excluding people based on race and not being inclusive in their behavior. But that's not how Dietrich Bonhoeffer applied the term cheap grace. He kind of used it as a derogatory term against our views, right?
And it's been used ever since.
Yeah.
And so we have people, they say what we teach is cheap grace, or they call it easy believism.
Yeah.
But either way, they think, no, you've got to pay a price. You've got to count the cost.
Right. You got to sacrifice. You got to be willing to die for Jesus in order to get everlasting life. And so he uses the term costly grace versus cheap grace, but in the end, whether the price you pay is cheap or costly, there's a price to be paid.
Right. But now I think one of the comments we got from that video was asking about something I said. What did I say that Michael found kind of odd?
Yeah, he had a question, basically. During that video, you said, because Jesus has given us everlasting life for free, and you had mentioned, well, what about all to him we owe, which I guess Michael says he presumes is a reference to the hymn, Jesus Paid It All.
Yeah, I had said in our discussion something like, we owe everything to Jesus because he paid everything, we pay nothing. And so I said, it's not cheap grace, it's free grace.
Yeah, it's free.
And so Michael now is asking, how can I quote that hymn, all to him I owe, when we really don't owe him anything? I think that's Michael's point, right?
His question is, since everlasting life is a free grace to the recipient, Michael asks, what exactly do we, quote, owe Jesus in exchange for the gift of everlasting life? Or how are we indebted to Jesus for everlasting life?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. And on the one hand, we owe him nothing if by that you mean, what do we owe him in order to keep it? Right?
Or to get it, right?
Or to get it. It's a free gift, so we don't buy it, and we don't pay anything to get it. That was my point. But we also don't owe him anything to keep it. But what I was talking about is there's a moral obligation. In other words, God has expectations for the believer. God expects the believer to obey Christ, right? Jesus expected us to deny ourselves, take up our crosses, and follow him. Matthew 16:24. He said, if anyone wishes to come after me in discipleship, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. And there's a lot of verses in the New Testament that suggest because he died for us, therefore we ought to lay down our lives for our fellow brothers and sisters in Christ. For example, 2 Corinthians 5:14 uses the expression, the love of Christ compels us, or the love of Christ constrains us. Paul is talking about the death of Christ.
2 Corinthians 5:14, for the love of Christ compels us, because we judge thus, that if one died for all, then all died. And he died for all, that those who live should no longer for themselves, but for him who died for them and rose again.
Notice the word should. This is a subjunctive in Greek, and the subjunctive comes over in English as something like should or that sort of thing, suggesting we're dealing with the moral imperative here. we should live for him, not we must live for him in order to retain everlasting life. Everlasting life is everlasting life, right? So if you could lose it, it wouldn't be everlasting. But the point is, we should live for him, and Paul sees it there, and John says the same thing. You know, we all know John 3:16, but how about 1 John 3:16?
1 John 3:16, by this we know love, because he laid down his life for us, and we also ought to lay down our lives for the brethren.
Now notice, we ought to lay down our lives for the brethren. Same idea. It's a moral imperative. And keep reading, because I think he goes on to say if we have the world's goods and we don't share those goods with fellow believers in our local churches that are in need, then there's a problem.
Yeah. But whoever has this world's goods and sees his brother in need and shuts up his heart from him, how does the love of God abide in him?
Right. So I don't think he's talking, by the way, about somebody who is panhandling on the side of the road and you're driving up to the intersection and this person's holding up a sign and they want money.
Yeah.
I have a policy. Y'all need to come up with your own policy, but mine is I do not give to panhandlers because I'm convinced that 99% of the time that money is going for drugs or alcohol, and it's not what I want the money to go for, and it's not being properly used.
It's coming. It'll be here before you know it. What am I talking about? The Grace Evangelical Society's National Conference 2025, May 19th through 22nd at Camp Copus, an absolutely beautiful campground in North Texas, right on the lake with lots of recreation, great food, a great place to stay, wonderful fellowship, and wonderful free grace Bible teaching. Information and online registration now at faithalone.org/events. First-timers waive registration fees. faithalone.org/events.
A certain percentage of these people actually make their living doing this.
Yeah.
They drive up, get out of their car, they sit on this street corner for 4 or 5 hours wearing poor clothes, and they make pretty good money each hour, and then they drive home and they've made some pretty good money. Now, that's a small percentage, but it is some of them.
Yeah. Question is, I guess, really, who is this brother that's being spoken of in verse 17?
Talking literally about a Christian brother. That would be in your local assembly. Look at, for example, James chapter 2, verses 15 and 16. After James talks about the fact that what would it profit someone if he has faith but doesn't have works, that's not going to save him from God's judgment. Then in verses 15 and 16, James gives an illustration.
If a brother or sister is naked and destitute of daily food, and one of you says to them, "Depart in peace, be warmed and filled," but you do not give them the things which are needed for the body, what does it profit?
And by the way, read 2:12, because what James is talking about there goes back to verse 12, which is a few verses before.
So speak and so do as those who will be judged by the law of liberty.
So it's not enough to say, we're also to do. And we're going to be judged both in this life and at the judgment seat of Christ by the Lord, by what we have not just said, but by what we've done. In fact, verse 13 indicates that he's thinking about the judgment seat of Christ. What does 2:13 say?
For judgment is without mercy to the one who has shown no mercy. Mercy triumphs over judgment.
Yeah, and I think he's ultimately thinking there of the judgment seat of Christ, because 2:14 to 26 is preceded by that statement, and 3:1 then says, "Let not many of you become teachers, for as such will incur a stricter judgment at the judgment seat of Christ." But here's my point. So speak and so do. If you look at 2:15 and 16, the guy says a good thing.
Yeah.
What does he say? Be filled and be warmed?
Depart in peace, be warmed and filled.
Be warmed and filled.
Yeah.
So he's saying, hey, I'm not going to give you any food, but go ahead and be filled, and I'm not going to give you any clothing, but be warmed. But I'm wishing you well, right?
All right.
But you don't give him what's needed for the body. What good is that? What profit is it? What use is it? And by the way, the Greek in 2:14 and 2:16 is exactly the same. Tita aphelos. What use is it? What good is it? What does it profit? And the point is, it doesn't profit me, because God's going to discipline me if I don't meet the needs of my fellow believers, but it also doesn't profit them. So coming back to Michael's question, we as believers have a moral imperative to help those believers. And notice, doesn't 2:15 say, someone among you?
If a brother or sister is naked and destitute of daily food.
Oh, okay.
And if a brother or sister,
Yeah,
it doesn't say
okay.
if a person, but then the other passage in 1 John was talking about brother.
Brother, sister.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so our focus needs to be on taking care of our brothers and sisters in our local church. Right?
And of course, we do have from Galatians 6:10, let us do good to all, especially the household of faith.
Mm-hmm.
What that suggests is, if you think of circles of importance, our closest circle is the family or household of faith. And then outside of that, of lesser importance, but still important, is doing good to all. Mm-hmm. And so, yes, we would help meet the needs of one of our neighbors that has a legitimate need that's not a believer, but only if we have vetted them to where we know that this money is going to be used wisely. For example, Paul says in 2 Thessalonians, if anyone will not work, let him not eat. And Paul's point is there were people in Thessalonica who were so convinced that Christ was coming back at any moment that they quit working. And Paul said, okay, if you can work but won't work, then you're going to get hungry because the other believers aren't going to help you.
This point about, I guess, how we owe Jesus is almost like if someone paid off all my credit card bills, I don't owe him something because he paid them off. I do kind of owe him, in a sense, a moral obligation. I'd like to take him out to dinner. I'd like to be available for him. I'd like to show love to him because he's already done so much for me. So in that sense, I do owe the person something.
It's kind of like the story with the bear that has a thorn in his paw and the little boy takes it out and suddenly the bear becomes the boy's protector.
Yeah.
We should have so much gratitude for what Christ has done for us and what he has given us, what it cost him and what he has given us, that we should live for him. Mm-hmm. And by the way, this is the way to fullness of life. When we deny ourselves, take up our crosses, and follow Christ, that's when we experience the abundant life that Christ has for us. It's not like when we do that, we're miserable. Yeah. When we do that, we're joyful. Yeah. This is really the way to happiness and to fullness of life in the life to come. So God rewards faithfulness, obedience, and we basically can't outgive God. So, yes, Michael, we're not required to give anything to keep everlasting life, but we are required to give of ourselves if we want God's blessings in this life and rewards at the judgment seat of Christ.
Yeah, we love him because he first loved us.
1 John 4:19, amen. And remember, everybody, keep grace in focus.
We invite you to check out our Monday, Wednesday, and Friday 5-minute YouTube videos at YouTube Grace Evangelical Society. You will love the content and learn a lot. Maybe you've got a question or comment or feedback. If so, please send us a message. Here's our email address. It's radio@faithalone.org. That's radio@faithalone.org. Please make sure your question is as succinct and clear as possible. That would be a great big help. On our next episode, does God convict all people of sinfulness? Please join us, and until then, let's keep grace in focus.
The proceeding has been a listener-supported ministry from the Grace Evangelical Society.